Hi everyone. As we've been suggesting, we've been wanting me and Nadia to start sort of dropping kind of Gaza specific or Palestinian specific kind of content, alongside the kind of ongoing dramas, to sort of share thoughts with you or share feelings with you outside of coffee moaning, because I realise, sometimes the gravity, if you like, of this kind of crisis sometimes tugs against the need often in coffee moaning to have a more sort of, not always, but, often frivolous kind of more fun fueled kind of time. I just wanted to talk. I mean, obviously Nadia did her piece last night, incredibly moving. If you haven't seen it, do go and check it out. Speaking from the heart, speaking about her feelings, about how this crisis has left her feeling, about the sort of shared trauma that we're all experiencing. And in fact, I've reached out to a couple of people in order to talk to some kind of psychotherapists, psychologists, specialists about how one manages the trauma, and not just the trauma literally of seeing this footage and seeing what's going on in Gaza, but also the trauma of, I think, a different trauma, the trauma of not being heard, the trauma of being gaslit into silence, the trauma of being made to think that you're going mad, or the trauma of propaganda and the trauma of the global political setup of our Western governments. Not all Western governments. I mean, there are notable exceptions like Spain and Ireland, but governments like ours, the UK and the US, who just seek to only promote the Israeli propaganda that is delivered by Israel, and literally marginalize and forever infer that any information that comes out of Palestine is not to be trusted. So I wanted to just talk about my disappointments and my frustrations and my trauma, because I'm sure this will speak to a number of you. One of the things that I've had that I find really traumatic, it's odd, beyond the immediate physical, humanitarian, humane, genocidal aspect. I mean, as if you can get beyond all of that. But I think something that's allowing this genocide to happen in plain sight, the only way in which this genocide is being allowed to happen in plain sight, the only thing that's facilitating this or allowing it or in fact perpetrating this genocide is the Western media and Western governments, and our refusal and our cowardly, steadfast, but it's not even necessarily cowardly, it's sort of arrogant refusal to accept or consider that what's going on and what's being done by Israel to the Palestinians is unacceptable. Much has been made of using the word genocide, and I find it a really kind of, it's an unpalatable conversation to be had about the idea of a genocide and the idea that a nation or a people can somehow own the copyright on what a genocide is. It's like Netanyahu and the Israeli government and the Israelis, who settlers and all those who are kind of anti-Palestine. It's important to stress, not everyone in Israel supports what Netanyahu and Israel are doing in Gaza or the West Bank. So that's a really important point to make. And I'm actually going to quote a few people, specialists, historians, professors, and the like, who are themselves Israeli, who are railing against what is happening in Palestine and the West Bank. But no one genocide looks the same. And I think, to promote this idea that unless you have the exact sort of iconography and structure of the Holocaust, with gas chambers and all of the awful, appalling, horrendous, entirely egregious and reprehensible and devastating kind of truths. Just look at something like the zone of interest and, the tattooist of Auschwitz. It's well reported, the awfulness of the Holocaust. But to use that as the template and then say that if it's not like that, it's not a genocide, is deeply, deeply flawed. And I want to quote quite quickly at the beginning here, a professor of Holocaust history at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Amos Goldberg, who claims that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And in their sort of opinion piece, the professor argues that what's happening in Gaza doesn't need to resemble the Holocaust in order to qualify as a genocide. Every genocide, as they say, is different. They are all motivated. But one of the interesting things that this professor has stated is nearly every genocide that's occurred, whether it be Srebrenica, whether it be the Tutsi genocide, where 800,000 people were slaughtered by the Hutus, it's not about numbers, and it's not necessarily about the industrial scale of it either. It's about intention. But one of the key constituent elements of a genocide is the argument that this is in self-defense. Self-defense is baked into the idea of an ethnic cleanse or a genocidal intent. Whether it be, the Nazi Germany's were saying this is a self-defense against the Jews, for instance. So, no one genocide looks the same. And so there are a number of professors, a number of people who argue that there is a genocide happening here. And just because it doesn't have the optics or the kind of exact similarities to other genocides, one can't use the Holocaust as an example or as the kind of, the blueprint for what genocides look like. That's wrong. And that is a misuse of the awfulness and the historical significance of the Holocaust to use it like that. It's about intention. So one of the things that comes up a lot about October the 7th, which is often used by the Israeli government and Israelis, is, this was a genocidal attack. This was a genocide. Well, it wasn't a genocide, but was it driven by genocidal intentions? Many feel that, of course, Hamas have said that they want the eradication of Israel, they want the eradication of Jews. But my argument on that is two wrongs don't make a right. If that attack, which was horrendous, which was hideous, but we will keep reiterating, was the latest kind of, if you like, conflagration in a long occurring conflict. Unpleasant, unpalatable, utterly unjustifiable in terms of the violence that happened. And yet at the same time, baked into the October the 7th idea, if you can argue that October the 7th was genocidal, then given surely the response that has been, so disproportionately incomparable to the original October the 7th conflict, let's just work on the kind of completely inaccurate assumption that this all started on October the 7th. Then, okay, let's just start. October the 7th happens, awful. Then what's happened since has to be whatever October the 7th was times 1,000, times 1,000,000, just in terms of deaths, in terms of infrastructure destruction, in terms of the scorched earth policy of the entire Gaza Strip, in terms of the continued resettlement and dehousing of Palestinians in the West Bank. So surely you can't have it one way and then not the other way. And so, of course, the argument that's always promoted is that it's self-defense. But my huge despair and my huge depression and my huge frustration with all of this is the absolute reluctance, the frustration, the heartbreaking frustration with the Western press, with our media, that as so-called journalists simply aren't asking the right questions. Editors, news stations, they're not running the right stories. They are running scared of the accusation of being anti-Semitic in terms of if they are critical of whatever narrative the Israeli government are promoting or trying to feed us. Of course, in the fog of war, there are lies and there is kind of, what's the first sort of casualty of war is truth and all that kind of stuff. It happens on both sides, absolutely. But this idea that it's only happening on one side with Hamas and with Palestine, but we should trust everything that the Israelis say is farcical, and it's insulting, and it's depressing, because of course one of the key constituent elements of the whole fucking conflict that really drives me nuts is we have not been allowed to send any journalists into Gaza. And I think that should be the first and only question that journalists in this country should be asking of any Israeli official, any IDF official, anyone talking about anything. Why can we not report from the war scene? That is the first question. And even if you're a journalist, and I understand that most journalists, you're not allowed to actually express your political opinion, we get that, Ofcom and all the rest of it. So many journalists that I can think of that haven't said a single word about it because, of course, they feel bound by journalistic objectivity. But what is journalistic objectivity? Is journalistic objectivity the Telegraph, the Mail? There is no such thing as journalistic objectivity. There's interrogating everything. That's, for me, is what a journalist is about. Interrogating everything, whether that includes getting to the heart of the awfulness of what happened on October the 7th, but also getting to the heart of the awfulness of what happened before October the 7th to Palestinians and what's happened since October the 7th to Palestinians. Interrogate. So journalists, whenever I hear or see or come across celebrities and journalists go, well, you know what, it's not really my place to kind of, I really shouldn't kind of comment on this. Sorry, Pontius Pilate, you're washing your hands of something here that can have all sorts of questions asked about it. Probing questions, interrogative questions. But it feels like no one wants to ask those questions for fear of the truths that will come out. It's like there's a kind of collective refusal to actually sort of face the fact that what we have in Israel, the Netanyahu manifestation of Israel, is the most temperamental, out of control, narcissistic teenager that we have all in the West mollycoddled and overindulged and never told off and forever found excuses for its behavior. And what we've seen is it's reached further and it's reached stronger and it's reached further. And today, you know, we're sitting on roughly the anniversary or the Independence Day for Israel, which, of course, the flip side of an Independence Day for Israel is the Nakba for Palestinians. And, you know, it was Yasser Arafat who plonked the date, sort of National Akbar Day, you know, on May the 15th, I think it was. But around that time, all those years ago, you know, Israel was in the process of establishing its state by pushing people out. And what I think we've seen so kind of transparently and shockingly, and I sometimes feel breathless with a sort of disbelief that what one's witnessing, not just in what you read or see in the mainstream media, but more often than not by what you don't see or read. And I think for me, one of the moments where it came into sharp focus was when the ICJ announced that there was a plausible that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. And I think we did coffee moaning Saturday papers. Not a single paper ran with that story because it didn't suit the narrative. We've talked so much on this channel about the way in which peaceful marchers are castigated as hate marchers when they are not hate marchers. You know, when Jewish people are critical of Israel, then the Zionists of Israel and the outspoken activists in this country, we all know who they are, the high-profile ones. They describe these Jewish people as self-hating Jews. It's like for every single moment we in whatever way we criticize Israel, there is some really quite nasty, pernicious, snide put down that seeks to diminish or dismiss the ability to be critical of Israel. There's such an arrogance, there's such a superiority. And I have to say, this speaks to, it seems kind of odd and coincidental that, Britain and America, two massively imperial nations, Britain in a much more sort of conventional sense of, go around the world, stick a flag in and subjugate, the natives. But in America too, they've done the same. And I think it's really important to note and notice in this whole crisis, the way in which I hate to say it, a sort of male white supremacy is at work, a colonial kind of imperialism is still at work and baked into the attitude, right down to the violence that was meted out on October the 7th, a lot of which has subsequently been debunked as based upon an incredibly fraudulent and dodgy article in the New York Times based on a woman walking around asking people for their hearsay comments on what they said they'd seen. Decapitated babies didn't happen. It's not to say atrocities didn't happen, they did. But the narrative that was being pursued there was, it was really important that everyone in the world got on board with the idea that when Palestinian people kill people, it's savage. But when Israelis kill people, it's moral. And we've talked before about this idea that, Israelis get killed, whereas Palestinians die, which removes that sense of cause and effect, the idea that anyone else is culpable. It's like if a Palestinian man dies, it's the Palestinian people's fault. But if an Israeli man dies, it's the Palestinian people's fault. That's the narcissistic transaction. You do something, if you do something wrong to me, you've hurt me. But if I do something wrong to you, you made me do it to you. It's classic passive-aggressive attitude. And so there is this colonial supremacy. And what's just been staggering is watching how our press, how our government, how our politicians, the Labour Party, we've talked so much about it, it's so disappointing. This is the phraseology that I use. It's disappointing. It's heartbreaking. It's this feeling that, that a particular narrative needs to be promoted or maintained. As each catastrophe happens, as each aid worker's killed, if it's a white aid worker, everyone comes out and says something. If it's a Palestinian aid worker, there's literally no comment at all. Ukrainian refugees are given a hot ticket to get into here, which is totally right. But if you're Palestinian, not at all. But of course, the danger with that is lots of kind of Israeli, kind of far-right Israeli activists and settlers are saying, well, why won't all the Arab nations take the Palestinians? Why don't they take them into their countries? Because once they're taken out, then Israel has succeeded in the forcible eviction of a race of a population. So you're in this hugely, tragic Faustian pact situation where to step out of your country to survive means you will never be able to step back into your country, and then actually the occupation succeeds. And I don't think it's exaggerated to say that this isn't not only an occupation, this whole conflict has an expansionist intent behind it. This isn't just about dealing with Hamas, getting the hostages home. It's never really been about getting the hostages home. And you can't defeat Hamas. What you will have created and what he will have created, Netanyahu has great sort of track record with this. He's funded directly Hamas in the past because he wanted to cause a schism between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and Fatah in the West Bank. He didn't want a united Palestinian front. The last thing he wants, the last thing Israel wants, is a united, coherent, singing from the same song sheet Palestinian people. It suits him and it suits the far right and it suits the settlers to have this conflict, because with conflict will come conflagrations like October the 7th. And when they happen, Israel and the far rightists can seize upon that and say, this is the reason we have to go in there and bulldoze it. Ben Gvir today, to celebrate, or yesterday to celebrate Israeli Independence Day, saying we need to forcibly evacuate and evict everyone, not evacuate even, but evict everyone from Gaza. This is gaining traction. And whilst everything's been going on in Gaza, in the West Bank, I think we've now hit 500 West Bankian Palestinians have died. None of the papers cover that. That's of no significance or equivalence to the savagery of October the 7th. And that's just 500 in the West Bank. Let's not talk about the 35,000 plus, which itself is a conservative estimate because the vast majority of bodies are still beneath the rubble. It's an absolute outrage. And so this language of savagery by the Palestinians, moral self-defense by the Israelis, is just staggeringly transparent. And I think the part of all of it that really, really sticks in my craw, and I think something that Nadia's talked about in her chat last night, and something I've seen coming through and she's seen coming through in a lot of comments, is the number of people in this country who just don't want to have an opinion on it, or don't want to talk about it, don't even want to acknowledge it. It's like, I can understand not understanding it. I can understand that. But then if you're with someone who does understand it a bit more, and you can see that they're stressed and they're traumatized by it, ask the question. See how they are. Ask why they're feeling this. Why would you circumnavigate your way entirely around it? It strikes me as totally, totally strange. And I've talked about it before. We've fallen into this really odd situation now where the Palestinian cause, Palestinians are not allowed to defend themselves. At what point will the Palestinians be afforded the luxury of any self-determining people, which they are not, which is what they're striving for, of self-defense? At what point will they be allowed to defend themselves, just as Israel has defended themselves? At what point does one say, okay, October the 7th, horrendous, reprehensible, unforgivable, but kind of explainable catastrophe? Because if you look at an occupation ends up with eruptions of violence, doesn't it? It's no different to the awful bombings of innocent people by the IRA. You're not justifying the violence, but you've got to understand where it's come from. And I'll say it once more. When the IRA was bombing mainland Britain, did we ever toy with the idea of carpet bombing and scorched earthing Belfast or Northern Ireland? No. It would never have been considered. We don't think of that. We wouldn't think of that. Why? Is it anything to do with the fact that we are so profoundly Islamophobic, that we are so profoundly, as our governments and our media are so profoundly shot through with the DNA of white supremacy and colonialism, that they can't see that actually these Palestinian people, are they just more sort of Arabs, more Muslims? And so this narrative that Islam and Muslims are always the enemy is just so palpable and so self-evident in our media. And I don't understand the people who stay silent. I don't understand how people just settle for this. Yes, people's lives need to go on. Yes, people have to pick and choose the great big things that they want to fight for and fight against. But when you don't see it come, when you see this stuff coming through, but the problem is, of course, they don't see it coming through because it's only coming through on social media. So social media tries to sort of show this material, and then the mainstream media does this thing of saying, oh, well, no, we've got to gaslight you all there. Don't trust social media. If it wasn't, I noticed that the West, the mainstream media and the West, adored social media when it was leading to what we called the Arab Spring. Do you remember that? Do you remember how important social media was, Facebook and Instagram, to spreading the word when it looked like, all these countries were going to embrace democracy, the good old Western democracy in which one vote means nothing, but let's pretend it means something. Do you remember that? Social media was really key at that point. But now, broadcasters like LBC, like Telegraph, GB News, IT, none of these, unless they get the footage or the material themselves, nothing else is to be trusted. And I think that is so misguided, because what's going to happen here is the mainstream are going to so lose the younger people. And that's why you're seeing these demonstrations. That's why you're seeing these encampments. Palestine has become a call celeb. This has become something that is representative of a sort of not being heardness for everyone, a put upon people. And when you can see the hypocrisy and the lack of accountability that Israel is put under, when you see America with zero compulsion or interest, in fact, quite the opposite, to rein Israel in, they stand at that podium in the White House arrogantly and snidely, and sort of pompously, putting down all these incredibly rigorous journalists asking the right questions, like, okay, so when are we going to, this organization, and this organization have all said that they're breaching and breaking international law. In fact, America has had to admit that they can't guarantee that Israel isn't breaking international law, but even though they might be, and they probably are, it doesn't mean we're not going to send weaponry. The US's refusal to hold Israel to account is one of the most unforgivable and yet most transparent acts of gaslighting I've ever seen. And I think the reason they can do it, how can they do it so cockily and so confidently? Because there are two options governmentally and politically in America. And at the moment, the guy who is propping up Israel, has propped up this genocide, has fueled, funded and equipped and prevaricated and said all these meaningless words about don't go into Rafah. Rafah's been gone into. Rafah's happening. Rafah's happened. Rafah won't happen with a kind of neatly organised phalanx of Israeli IDF troops all going marching in, because that would be the optics and that wouldn't be good. Once again, get some fucking press in there. Get some of the world's press in there. Let them in there. Why aren't people asking that? Why isn't the US being asked? Why won't the press go in there? Why can't the press go in there? No one wants to talk about that. No one wants to even mention that, because the longer it goes on, the longer there isn't any kind of worldwide press covering this, the further and further away we're going to get from the intensity of what's happened. And I think one of the reasons that me and Nadia feel it's so incumbent on us to keep flagging up what seem like the smaller details in the story now, or in the evolution of this story, is that at the very point that everyone is going to be turning away, and I think there's no coincidence that the West and the Western media has a vested interest, though this isn't to say that what's happening in Ukraine isn't happening, because I think Putin has been operating in the shadows, the focus has been off him and all this kind of stuff. It will suit the West wonderfully for the world, what attention the world's media has been giving Israel and Palestine, for it to be resituated and refocused on Ukraine and the plight there. And when you start to look at the likes of Ben Gvir and Netanyahu, this is, we are dealing with a deeply disturbed approach. There is no end game to this. I've said it many times. The only thing I think that Netanyahu is doing, or is playing for time. He's waiting for Trump to get in. As I was just about to say, the best option at the moment is Biden, and look at him. Look at it. He's been a facilitator. He's been the most sort of indirectly supporting Zionist facilitator they could have hoped to have had. And now you've got incoming the likelihood of Trump, even though he might be behind bars, screaming that, if you're Jewish, you can't support Biden because Biden, who has supported and stacked up and just kept Israel going all the way through this and held them to no account whatsoever, is now being classed as a bad bet for Jewish voters in America. That's how extreme things are. And that's why these really supercilious arsewipes of press officers in the White House can stand there and sneer at the world's press and pretend that when a report comes in, or a sort of an investigation has been done by the IDF, then this is reputable and this is dependable and we can rely on that. Only America could actually, in a sort of, it was kind of like in a sort of New York mob style fashion, threaten officials at the International Court of Justice, at the ICJ and the ICC, only they could threaten them with sanctions, but not threaten the Israelis. When you look at all of this, when I look at the kind of history of Europe and the history of the UK, and you reach all the way back to the turn of the century, I was reading about the history of the Nakba and how it evolved, and how Zionist kind of Jews kind of, migrated to, the Middle East and to Palestine, and how there was actually, the local Palestinian Jewish community had zero interest in Palestine and Jerusalem and around there, had zero interest in creating a separate Zionist Israeli state. What happened was an influx, obviously, of Zionist Jewish people, facilitated and helped by the various kind of laws and rules and carving up of the area with the Balfour Agreement and the UK governments and all this. Israel was created out of a colonial game of what was that game? Is it called Civil War? No, not Civil War. Civilization. It was like they had a battlefield and they got a ruler and they drew a line through the sand and carved it up, and then tried to fit into this artificially created shape an entire culture. Finally, on all of this, the part of it all that just sticks in the craw is just watching the ways in which every single sort of moment of opposition or articulation of opposition to what Israel is doing, any support for Palestine, any explanation of what's happening for the Palestinians, the way in which it's still, to this day, in very different ways characterized as anti-Semitic, as a way of closing down discussion, closing down critical thinking, it's just so shocking. And I would just argue again to all those celebs, all those blue tickers, all those so-called journalists who say they can't cover it. Okay, you can't cover it and express an opinion outside of who you're working for your broadcaster. But you can make sure, if you have responsibility for your output in any way, shape or form, you can make sure that you bring balance to your coverage, that you look at both sides, that you give exposure to stories on both sides. Let's face it, at the moment, I don't see, apart from a few missiles being thrown, and I saw an incredibly hot-shotted Palestinian in the West Bank take out a drone, an Israeli drone with a stone. There's this idea, there's an equivalence that's been drawn. And I understand why people get really intolerant of the idea of calling it a war. You're dealing with one of the most sophisticated intelligence services and army personnel on one side, and you're essentially dealing with a bunch of, resistance fighters, all firing rockets, shit rockets that get shot down within seconds, that go in the wrong direction, and stones. And you're trying to draw an equivalence. There is no equivalence. There is zero equivalence. I just find it so unsettling that so many people are willing, and I'm not talking about ordinary people for whom they don't understand it. I get it. But what I would say to you is, if you don't understand it and you meet someone who does understand it or has a strong opinion on it, ask them questions, be sensitive, be inquiring. It's why we've been given a fucking brain, for God's sake. Ask questions. But if you're a journalist or if you're a celeb and you're very outspoken, I'd like to know, of all those celebs and journalists with blue ticks out there on all social media platforms, if you were shouting for, as all of us were, Ukraine when Putin invaded, why won't you do the same for Palestine? That's the simple question at the end of all of this. Why aren't Palestinians being given the same support and exposure for their cause as the Ukrainians were when Putin invaded?